Hello, everyone, and welcome to the User Experience Illuminated with Dawn Hollingsworth. I'm Teresa Nissen, and I'm the ILD Director of Training and Professional Development. Before we begin, we wanted to go over a little bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions, please click on the Q&A icon to type in your questions. And the questions will be answered live with Dawn at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat function for any technical issues, and a staff member will get back to you in a private conversation to help you address those. And finally, just to remind you, this session will be recorded and you will have access to all of the sessions about a week or two after the conference is over. Your microphones and cameras will be muted. Well, your microphones will be muted and your cameras will be turned off for the duration of the session. And now I'd like to introduce Dawn. Dawn Hollingsworth is the principal of Dark Horse Lightworks. She's a certified lighting designer and a well-accredited professional by the International Well Building Institute. She is also a fellow of the IALD. Dawn has diversified expertise in theatrical and architectural lighting design, control systems, marketing, business management, product management and development, manufacturing, scenic design, and event production. And now here's Dawn and her presentation.
Thank you, and I want to express how appreciative I am of everybody coming today. This is wherever you are in the world. I know there's a variety of time zones here, so it might be morning or afternoon or evening for you, but thank you for coming. I always want to start with knowing where I'm going, and it's always a good idea to kind of figure out where you want to end up, right? So the idea for this presentation came out of some frustrations I had in designing control systems. And in particular, there was a system that I thought I was being very clever and very forward thinking and giving a school a network control system that was very easy to use. And yet they kept coming back and saying, we don't understand how to use the lighting control system. So over the course of several months, it became a back and forth and trying to get them to understand how to use the control system. And when in fact, most of the controls were automatically activated by occupancy sensors, but it still was very frustrating for them. So I started thinking about this idea of the user experience and how we could improve that for our clients. I also want to talk about some documents and some ways of conveying our intent on the design documents. So I'm going to cover that as well. And then it's important to coordinate the controls with everyone, even if you're not designing them, and especially if you are. It's important to coordinate that with the whole design team. When things were simple, when systems were simple, it was a very easy thing. We turned on a light switch and the lights came on. And we still have some systems today that might use this in simple designs or in specifically in residential work. But as we get more complicated, now we have to start thinking about how people are going to interface with the system. And here's a perfect example of a 0 to 10 analog system, and maybe many of you don't use this system. It doesn't really matter. It's the idea that there's 3 zones here, but there's 4 buttons. Okay, so what do I do with these? Are these zone controls, or are they preset controls? And that's what we have to really think through in how we define these systems. As our systems get more complicated, we now have more attributes or more addresses or more things we have to know about the lighting fixtures. And all of those attributes and addresses have to be assigned to some place on the controller or on the user interface in order for people to access that. So it becomes, again, something that we have to think through a lot more deeply while we're designing the systems. And that's true for DALI or DMX systems. It doesn't really matter. You all are probably very familiar if you're practicing in Europe, which is widely uses DALI. and you're widely familiar with this, but I'm less interested in all of this back-end architecture as I am about the one item on the right there, the user controls. The controls can be wireless. Again, it doesn't really matter what the back-end system architecture is. What we really want to focus on today is the user experience. And that's the way that we interact with systems. The user experience is where we develop emotions and where we develop the affinity for what we are using. It encompasses all of the users' feelings about the company, about the services, about the products, about the result of the building that you have worked on to give them. So it's the ultimate of what we are trying to do is how we use the systems that we put into place. Now, these can be software interfaces, hardware interfaces, and it can be a combination, certainly, of both of them. Maybe you have a PlayStation or an Xbox or whatever, but you certainly know that it does take a little bit of orientation to understand the controls and how to manipulate the characters or the elements in a video game. It could be your phone, and whether you're an Android or Apple user, or it doesn't really matter. Everyone has an affinity. Everyone has a very strong feelings about the user interface. It could be a streaming service, and is that interface easy to work with? So that one happens to be more software-based, but in the case of TiVo, for example, they spent a tremendous amount of time designing this remote control to work with their TiVo service. And this remote control, which they call the Peanut, there's a whole story. You can Google that story online, but there's a whole story about the development of the shape and the size and the button arrangement of the remote control. So it became a very, very important design element on how they felt that people were going to interface with their systems. So it's that kind of thought that I think we have to bring to lighting control systems. And context matters. So there's a difference between the user interface and the user experience. So aesthetically, users preferred the glass bottle, and it created a more compelling experience. And when users were asked for authenticity, they chose the glass bottle, even though the usability of getting the ketchup out of the bottle was more difficult and frustrating. But in other contexts, like a picnic or maybe even at home, users preferred the plastic bottle. So you see, there really is a difference between the experience of using these two bottles, even though the product inside them is exactly the same. And yet, this is what we give our customers. This is what we give our clients. We give them systems that have to be marked with a Sharpie, that are difficult to tell. Maybe this is a remote cabinet. I can't even see the lights that I'm affecting when I raise and lower these switches. So this would not be what I would consider to be a pleasant user experience. And this, we clutter the wall with all sorts of knobs and dials. And you would seriously need a crash course in how to operate all of these switches. And I suspect, since this is not a finished product, I don't know where this, or it's not a finished project, I don't know where this project is, that someone will end up putting labels somewhere on this. But between this is likely audio and a thermostat and lighting, and but it's a mess on the wall. And I don't think this is what we want in terms of the way people would look at this and respond to this. And yet, systems are enormously frustrating for people. It's either too simple or it's too complex, but regardless, it's just frustrating. Now, the user understands only 3 things about the lighting system. And the remarkable thing about this is that the user isn't focused on the lighting at all. They're frustrated with the lighting because they can't operate or understand the controls. The controls are distracting the user from the experience of the lighting. And all they know is the control system is too expensive or it's too complicated. I don't know how to use it. This is again, the expression that my client kept saying, we don't know how to use it. And I kept writing back in emails saying, you know, you just have to walk into the room and the lights should automatically come on. Now, if the lights weren't automatically coming on, then they should have communicated that back. So it's just one of those things where we just had a definite communication problem in trying to get them to understand how to use the system. But ultimately, their feeling was, I'm probably going to have to pay someone to come back and fix it. So who is the user of the lighting controls? Is it, I don't know, a construction manager? They control the budget, a facility manager. They have more technical knowledge, but you know, are they really going to be operating it? Is it the occupant? And they have the least exposure to lighting control systems and the most interaction. We have these technical users, and as I mentioned, it could be because of code requirements, it could be the owner's project requirements, it could be the programmer, it could be, you know, all the features we think that we're putting into the system. And because we're technical people, or we're thinking from a technical standpoint. So, you know, sometimes we have to think about the fact that we have these non-technical users who are the end users, and all they want to do is turn the lights on. And they're looking at, does it work as it is expected to do? And can I get enough light, or is there too much light? So these are the balance that we have to weigh in designing systems. A negative effect can make it harder to do easy tasks. And obviously, the reverse is true. So the positive effect can make it easier to do difficult tasks. So hindering the user from decision-making by offering too many choices can cause negative emotions like frustration. Let's make it easier for the user to move through the flow you've designed by aiding them to understand the functionality you're trying to achieve at every touch point. And at any touch point, the user lays eyes on the interface you have chosen for them. Good design is discoverability. It's understanding. And how do we achieve communication? How do we achieve that understanding? So if we look at the elements of the user experience, we have 5 layers. The strategy is the reason for the product. Why did we choose this particular system? The scope defines functional and content requirements. What features must the system have? The structure defines how the user will interact. For an example, does the user have to do something? Is the interface preset, or is it zone control? The skeleton is how the user interacts with the system. Is it a touch screen, or is it physical buttons? It could be an iPhone app. The content is what zones does that button affect. And the surface is what is the sensory experience of the product. I know that my sister resisted buying an iPhone for years, and she stuck with a phone that had tactile buttons. She finally had to succumb because it became out of date, and some other features that she wanted were only available for the iPhone. She's still struggling with the interface and really resisted it for the longest time, but because she really wanted the feel of those tactile buttons. How long does it take for the lights to come on after a transition? So some of it could be timing. So who designs the lighting control system? And why does it matter? Oftentimes, I find that electrical engineers are doing a lot of the back-end work. They might be doing the wiring. They might be doing all the circuiting. But ultimately, it matters because when it comes down to it, they're not looking at the electrical engineer. They're looking at the lighting designer, because the lighting controls are so closely tied to the lighting system that they're looking at you, and when it doesn't work, they're pointing the finger at you. So we have to take responsibility for the front end of the lighting system. And that's really what this entire concept is about. It really is irregardless if it's a dolly system or a DMX system or analog or phase dimming. It doesn't really matter what the back end is. But ultimately, the back end has to work in concert with the front end. They have to be compatible. So it might be a situation where you and, if you're not doing the electrical engineering or you're doing the lighting, that you and the electrical engineer are in agreement that this is the system we're going to use, and you're going to be responsible for this part of the scope, and I'm going to work on this part of the scope. So the front end is whatever, the interface design is whatever the user touches. Now, these buttons are really quite lovely and beautiful, and I found them on a European website, and I don't even know what they control. Apparently, they might control speakers or audio. I don't really know. It would be hard to imagine that they control lighting, but it would also be hard to imagine that unless you actually trained the owner in what they were controlling, that they would understand how to use this, as simple as this is, and beautiful. This is typical, as I've shown you before in other examples. This might be typical. We have switches, we have rocker switches, we have rotary dials, we have, and even in one of the second row there, we have a timer. So again, all of these with some with labels, some with not, some are not. Again, it's a mishmash, and people just all end up turning everything on, and because they don't really know what it controls. This is another situation where it looks like the controls were replaced with something that was much simpler, that it looks like that these controls here possibly would have been some sort of scene controller or some sort of larger panel, that ultimately they got tired of that, and they just put in 4 switches, these actual dimmer switches that allow them to control the lights. So this is just one of those things where people can get really frustrated and not know how to use the system. This is another really lovely one where there's, I guess one needs repair, but beautiful arrangement of rows, but again, it's in a closet. I can't really see what's happening. You can't really tell what light level is what. I can't tell if it's set. And I would need, and personally, I would need a ladder to get probably to the top 2 rows. So this is just, there has to be a much better way of doing this. But I do want to show you the next slide. This was actually at an IALD Enlighten conference several years ago, and we were in the ballroom, and all of us were remarking about how the system was designed, but also the fact that they took to labeling all of these. And here's a close-up of one of the switches. They actually went to the trouble of labeling. Here, if you tap once for the preset, you tap twice for full on. I mean, this is how this is extremely complicated, simple dimmer switch. And look at, there are no less than 7 instructions here to turn on these chandeliers. So that I have to think there has to be a much better way of designing systems than this. So when we look at user devices, you know, there are some very elegant devices out there that we can put with custom engraving. This is a very simple one. This happens to open shades as well as offering us 5 different presets and the ability to raise and lower. So again, it could be a simple timer, and that may be appropriate for the device that you need in that particular location. They could be touch screens, and again, much more flexible in terms of programming, but we have to make sure that we label the device and we label and we make people understand that scenes and zones might have different control screens. So there does take some training for this. The devices could be on your iPhone now, very simple. This one happens to be my own home, as I have an iPhone interface with my some of my control system in my home. It also ties into Alexa, so the same system ties into 2 different apps on my phone. And that again is great for residential work. It's very easy for most people now to adapt. Even I love it. It's a great system, and I can operate it from anywhere that I can get internet. When we have color tuning devices, again, those can be somewhat more complicated and complex. People don't often understand color tuning. Here's a particular device as well that I look at it, and there's a readout here that says it's on 3,500 Kelvin. But to be really honest, I don't know what 3,500 Kelvin means if I'm not a lighting designer. And so I don't know if that's the color I want. There are other devices that might have scales of sort of the color temperature scale that might be a little bit more intuitive. But you know, this is something that, again, we want to think about in terms of who is going to be the operator. If this is going into a classroom, again, the teacher is not necessarily wanting to be trained on how to control the lights. They just want to be able to teach. So making it difficult for them is not really at the top of our list. So here's one that's a little bit simpler. At least we have 4 levels here, and we can say, okay, if I touch it up here, I'm probably going to have a cool light. If I touch it down at the bottom, I might have a warm light. Again, it's a little bit easier to understand this interface without some training. So again, if we go back to our elements of the user experience, and we now want to break this down and say, how does this really relate to the way I need to think of this, of the design of the system? So once we decide how we want to organize our scene setting and our information, we can then go on to work on the documentation. And I have some samples of documentation that I'd like to show you. Now, this is one that I received from an engineer, and you can see it's quite dense. If this were on a large scale piece of paper, it might be readable. I understand for you right now, it is not readable, and that is on purpose. I just wanted to emphasize the density of this information. Now, this is a pretty large scale stadium project, so it has a lot of rooms, and this one was organized by rooms. So I chose to blow up one small area here so we could just take a look at what's happening. And this obviously is a conference room, and it has a multi-scene control panel in here, and it has an on-off, obviously. But what is the problem with this? Well, in my opinion, this doesn't really tell us anything about, it doesn't tell us really what zones we're controlling. So we would have to actually go to the drawings for the Legends Club conference room, and we'd have to figure out the zones. It doesn't tell us anything about the levels. It doesn't tell us how many actual scenes are involved. So in this way, it conveys a tremendous amount of information, but in reality, it conveys almost no information. So if we have another example here, and again, quite a dense piece of paper, and we have to zoom in to this to see what this actually says. And in this case, we have, this is actually a sort of more of a warehouse operation, but it's a little bit simpler. However, we have designated the area here. We can see the area. We can have a switch that has maybe 4 buttons to it. So it has 4 push buttons. We can tell that it's controlling fixtures type H and W4 and in the area D corridor, which is a little strange because this is actually supposed to be area C. So I don't know if that's correct or not. But we have a single top button with an only on function. And if we go down to the all off, we have an all off button here. And then they've been able to segregate these loads of H and W between each other. So this isn't this isn't a bad way of doing it, but it's just, again, it's very dense. It's a lot of text. It's a lot to read and a lot for a programmer to try to process. So, but it does work, and it does show a little bit more information than what we had before. Now, this is another way of doing this, and again, this is a little bit easier to read. So this is called a sequence of operations. And I want to just zoom in on a classroom here. So I'm going to kind of zoom in and make this a little bit bigger. And if down at the sort of the bottom of the screen, we have this classroom. We have a manual on, and we have an off in 10 minutes. Primarily, this is driven by an occupancy sensor here, and it's off via manual controls. Well, but we don't say anything about what those manual controls are. We don't describe the manual controls. We don't show anything about what those manual controls look like. And we also know from this that it says to reduce the lights by 15%. So we know these have to be somewhere on a dimmer, but it really doesn't tie all of that information together. So I want to show a very simple way tying back to the user interface and to the user experience. I want to tie back a very simple project that sort of brings all of these elements together in a more visual way that is expressed on the plans as opposed to in a bunch of schedules. There are schedules that go with this, but they will be simplified and more visual as we go along here. So this is a very simple classroom building. You can actually see the outline of the whole building here. This is an RCP. This is a plan version. I'm going to blow these up so that you can read these a little bit better. We're going to concentrate on this little classroom right here. But the reason that I wanted to give you an overview is simply because there's two separate systems. So the strategy for this project was that this performing arts classroom here is going to use a DMX system, and the rest of this classroom building is going to use an analog 0 to 10 system that's a little bit simpler. So right now I just want to focus in on the performing arts classroom. So here's more of a blow up. Here's more of a reflected ceiling plan. The structure that I'm trying to create here, the functional is defining the functional requirements. The owner requested, the school requested that they had control from both inside the classroom, which is this location here, and outside the classroom. So they were going to develop some seating, some outside seating area here. This is a pretty small classroom, but in case they wanted to do some performances, they wanted to be able to seat some parents out here. And so if we wanted to have a backdrop here, this is the control room, and we needed control in the control room. And we also needed control in the classroom in case that there was nobody necessary in the control booth. But if we had a drape here covering the back wall, we wouldn't be able to see what's happening. So we would need to be able to accommodate control outside of the control booth. Now, one of the other things that I like to do is I like to show the zones. Again, I'm not concerned about the back end wiring. I don't really care how the zones are tied together on the system, on the architecture of the system, but I want to make sure that the zones are isolated on the plan. So rather than going to strictly an Excel zone schedule and showing that, I want to tie it back visually on the plan. So the scope of what I'm trying to accomplish here are all showing the zones on next to the tag for the luminaire. So I'm going to also highlight here this zone 7 and zone 10 in the control booth, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. So, and again, to isolate the DMX addresses, showing them on a plan as opposed to showing them in some sort of Excel schedule makes the whole project more visual and a lot easier for a contractor or an installer to read. These C2 luminaires here are part of the house light system, and they are controlled through the DMX system that ties into the control console and or the in-classroom controls. So each one of these were assigned a DMX address and a zone as well, so I can tell exactly what is controlled together. So all these ones are all controlled on the same the same zone, but they can also be isolated to control them individually if they needed to be on a DMX address. The theatrical lighting is also shown here and with the DMX address and the instrument number. So I have a legend here showing the instrument number, the luminaire number, and the DMX address. Again, it just gives a programmer an easy way to reference the drawings as opposed to, again, looking at a bunch of Excel sheets and a bunch of lighting paperwork. It's all on the drawings. Now, again, going back to that structural component of trying to create, we created a wireless interface for the flexible remote control so they can move this anywhere they want. Again, we have a wireless transceiver in here in the control room, and we can have a receiver out here on a desk out in the courtyard if we wanted. And then moving to the skeleton layer, I wanted to create a visual representation of the location of all the user devices. Each one of these user devices, this could be a touch screen, this could be a control station on the wall. In fact, these items are occupancy sensors. These items are push button stations. Here's the lighting console sitting on the desk. So all of these elements are shown on a plan view on the plans to make it, again, very clear and something that makes it easy to reference on the drawings. That control console is shown here in a riser diagram, and the touch screen in the wall is also shown, and how all of this ties together and all the button stations. Now, all of the house lighting and any other back of house lighting, the storage areas, the vestibule entrance are all controlled off of this panel, and you can see occupancy sensors here and all of the stage lighting here. So again, going back to how I feel we should tie the user experience to this idea of the strategy, the scope, the structure, the skeleton, and the surface is a way to tie this back into a lighting control system. I look at these as the physical, I look at the strategy as the physical component. I look at the scope as the zoning. The structure is really the sequence of operations. What do I really want to have happen? The skeleton is now another layer that we would refer to as scene setting, and then ultimately the surface being the sensory experience of what people actually experience. So one of the ways that I make this simple for people is I develop a schedule for all of the devices. So as you noted on the plan view, every one of the devices has a number and it has a device tag, just like a luminaire would have a tag. So whatever system you use, I just lump all of mine into the letter Q. Makes it simple that if it starts with a Q, then I know it has to be a control device. So each one of these devices, whether it's an occupancy sensor or whether it's a push button station or a touch screen, all of these devices have a way to identify them, and they tie back to the riser diagram. And it's just a blow up of that device schedule. So I can see that it's a 4-button station with a fader control, or it's a wall mount vacancy sensor. Again, going back to the device type and location, I can see those devices here on the wall, where they're located. I can identify them for the architect so they know exactly where all of these switches are located, and we can coordinate that to make sure that I don't have something else interrupting that location. Sometimes as a matter of fact, since I did the presentation, the engineers came back and said, well, we need to have wall space here for some panel or whatever. And so sometimes you might have to move that device in case you have to coordinate that with other equipment. So it's always good to show this equipment on the plan. And then I detail that out into a zone schedule here, which I say, okay, so I go back to those 2 zones, the zone 7 and zone 10, and I have this in the control mixing room. I have the type, the fixture type here. I have the quantity, or the zone here. I have the quantity here. I have the wattage, and I can then tell what my total zone watts are here. I can also decide if it's going to be an emergency, a daylight zone of some sort, a skylight, which is certainly in California, we have to identify and isolate luminaires that are in primary, secondary, and skylight zones. I can identify the device type, and so it's the device is a Q50, which I showed you an example of, and it's the first incident of a Q50. So that is if there's a second one, like in the next room over is a recording studio, that is the second incident of the Q50 device. And then I show what type of control protocol it's going to use. So again, this can all be done in Excel. I do it in a different program, but it can all be done in Excel. And again, all of these schedules can be put onto the drawings. I found that when information is in manuals or in additional paperwork, it does not get conveyed to the field as often as it should. When information is on the set of drawings, it is much easier to coordinate that with the installing contractors. So then just talking a little bit about scene setting, I think this is the area that after the sequence of operations, this is probably the area that where people stop. They stop just before scene setting, because scene setting really you have to determine, I want these lights to be at 70%. I want these lights to be at 50%. You have to start somewhere. And so it's best to start somewhere, and by saying, okay, let's make the top button 100%. So we know we have that. Let's make the bottom button 0%, and how many buttons we have in between can determine how many levels we have at our disposal. So we want to know where the user devices are. We want to know what happens. And this is the real crux of this presentation, is what happens when the button is pushed. Does it activate a scene? Does it activate a zone? And that is something that you have to determine how that's going to operate, because the owner can't do that. The owner doesn't understand how to do that. And can the user use automatic controls, and can they override them like daylight or occupancy sensors? So that's really the crux of this entire presentation. It's just one slide. Now here's a way that I have also used the same information to decide, okay, I'm going to show you exactly each one of these devices. Now I can go back to my Q50-1, which is up here in the corner, and I can say, here are zones 7, and I'm going to zero in on that because I know that's unreadable, but this should be readable. So I have my Q50-1, and that was that 4 button with the fader station. I'm controlling zones 7, 8, and 10 because I have a zone outside of the vestibule of running lights that I need to turn on and off. So the zone 7 is just going to simply be turned on with the first button. Zone 7 will be turned off with the second button, and zone 10 on and zone 8 on. So, and ultimately it won't matter because there's an occupancy sensor in the room that when the space is now no longer occupied, everything will turn off. So I don't really have to worry about turning everything off. But I had to think that through and say, is this station going to work for my needs? Because even with this system, there are limitations to what this station can do. I might have had to go to an 8-button station, but I really liked the idea of having this fader button, because then I can use the fader to set this zone, which is really the lights over the console and the sort of lights that would be used in the space for running a show. I can actually have a lot more discrete control over that zone. So this is all, I had to think through this. I had to go through this. I had to have a meeting with the manufacturer of the control system to say, what can I do with these zones? How are these buttons going to react? And we went through a whole conference of how exactly are these buttons going to be used. And so all this could be documented ahead of time. So now all the programmer has to do is have this sheet in front of them, and they can go without me. The other element is what color is the device. I have found that everything is white unless it's not. So sometimes we don't want white devices on black walls. So here's a situation where somebody specifically chose to put a white device on a wood wall. Probably wouldn't consider wanting to do that personally from aesthetic. I'd probably want it to be black maybe, or it could be brown. But in this case, somebody is probably wanting this to be the marketing literature. They wanted this to show a little bit more carefully, so they chose to put a white device on a wood wall. But I found this to be very interesting. This is a unique device for control, and that there were a lot of interesting black accent elements in this scene. So again, obviously, this was a marketing literature for this control device, which is quite unique, but it goes really nicely with all of the accents in the space. And then finally, we want to think about engraving, and we don't want to think about it in this context. So there is actually a legitimate company that sells these labels, and you can have them engraved, and then you can screw them into the faceplate. But let's try not to do it that way. We can generally, every manufacturer has some sort of an engraving sheet, and you can describe it here in the lines. You can decide what is button 1 going to be, what is button 2. I spoke with a manufacturer the other night about saying, hey, you know, it'd be really great if we just had some standard nomenclature that was more than blank. So you need to think about nomenclature. And again, the problem with engraving is simply that the owner that takes over this building needs to have a say in this. And it's very difficult for them to decide sometimes what they want that nomenclature until after they've lived with the building for a while. Some rooms might want it and other rooms might not. So, but it is something to consider. And when we get it right, it looks really quite good. So we have an ability to make this interface look really good. So in the end, great design is thoughtful. It has to be a pleasurable experience. And it's how people remember their interaction with the systems that we design. So their interaction with the lighting system is through the control system. So I encourage you to think through, how can you improve your ability to work with the user experience to create better control systems. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I really appreciate your time. And now I would like to open it up to questions. I just want to thank everybody. And again, I'm sorry, a lot of people had an interaction of blurry slides, but just to reiterate, the handout is available in the link in the chat, and you can go get the slides there. But really, the concepts that I'm talking about were not really dependent on you being able to read all of that text. So I hope that didn't really distract you too much from the overarching concepts that we were trying to convey. But again, please go check out the handouts if you have more questions. And if anybody has a question, I'd like to address that.
Dawn, I do have a question here for you. Says, do we do too much with control? My experience is that when we both plan for total controllability and customers demand flexibility, but is it really fully used by the end users? Are we doing too much?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's difficult, and I find that it's really hard to get the clients to focus on the lighting controls until the very end of the job. But unfortunately, you have to you have to plan for that in advance in order to be able to install them. So I would say that for the most part, if we can design systems that are software dependent, that allow us to reprogram easily, that's probably going to give you that most flexibility. But often I find that when people say they want flexibility, they really say that, but they don't necessarily really mean that, because they're afraid of commitment, you know, like a lot of people. So I think that I worry a little bit less about that, but I have, from my first experience that I was alluded to in the beginning with the school, I think, you know, I have tried to outline as much as I can, so that I have even the architect has an opportunity for the owner to review those sequence of operations. They have a chance to review the device schedule, and to really see, is this going to meet your needs?
Yeah. Sometimes too many choices are
Yes.
too much.
Yes.
We do have another question. It says, where do you define the line between lighting design, I guess, and engineering? If putting together load schedules, does that blur engineering versus lighting designers versus engineering roles?
Another good question. I'm not actually putting together the load schedule. I'm actually putting together what I am in a way, but it allows me to identify for the engineer the front end, and to say, okay, these are the zones, and this is the wattage in the zone. The engineer can take that and then wire it up however they want. I just need to make sure that the zones are identified the way that I need them, and identifying the number of fixtures and the number of and the wattage allows me to make sure I haven't overloaded anything. So I don't really consider that the engineering. I consider then running conduit and wiring and all of that is the engineering portion of it. And I really don't do that. I don't worry about how the engineer does the back end. But I do care that things are wired the way that they need to be wired from a zoning standpoint. So I think it's important to convey those zones. And so that's why I really take the time to do that zone schedule.
Right. So we have another one from Jane, who asks, when you have lots of DMX protocol along with architectural lighting, how often do you specify a specialty systems integrator to help with installation and commissioning?
Yeah, good question. I didn't really touch on, but I always put on my plans that I recommend. In fact, I don't really recommend it. I really put it as a condition of the specifications that they hire a systems integrator. I think it's really important if there's a DMX system. Many contractors are very used to either installing Dolly or analog or digital systems, whatever they from various manufacturers. But DMX is not something that your standard electrical contractor is really familiar with. So I do put on my conditions of the specifications on the drawings. And again, I put all of my specifications on the drawings. I don't like things left to manuals, because I found that manuals don't make it to the job site and the drawings do. So I put all those notes on the drawings, and I make sure that I'll give them 3 choices of system integrators that I've worked with in the past, or that I would recommend, and that they should call them. So I think that's important, because that way you know that the DMX is going to get terminated properly, and it's going to get and the wiring is going to get checked out. So I think it's a great idea if you've got DMX.
So how much extra time does it take you to provide that level of detail?
I look at it. It does take a little bit of extra time. I actually have now, in recent projects, I've been putting it into my fee, and considering the fact that I outline that in the proposal, but I don't think my fee is what's driving the job as much as larger, electrical, mechanical, and plumbing fees, and other consultants that get paid a lot more than I do. So I don't feel like it's a detriment to ask for a few hours to do this work. So I just build it into the fee anymore. And I also think that it saves me time on the back end of the job, because what was happening was that I would be on site looking at the lighting. I'd be checking it out, and someone from the client side would find out I'm the lighting designer, and then obviously they would start talking about, okay, well, we don't know how to work this over here. We don't know how to do this controls. You know, where do we turn this on? Where do we? And it was one of those things where I thought, you know what, if I'm not doing the control system and I don't have any idea how this control system is going to work, they look at me and they think I'm doing all of it. So I might as well do the front end. And that way I should be able to access and give them some instructions about how to operate the system. I just found that it was there was this disconnect, and I was on site and the electrical engineer was nowhere to be found. And in fact, I find that they rarely are on site at the same time I am, almost never. So no one ever equates the lighting control system to the electrical engineer. They equate it to the lighting person. So it's worth the time in the project because it saves me time on the back end.
Great. So I have another one here. Did you ever experiment with a sensibilization? I don't know that word. Sensibilization to the device, or experiment session with the user along with the project?
I'm not sure the word. Whoever sent that question, could you clarify what that word might be? But there are, as a matter of fact, I'm getting ready to do a color changing system. And so I've outlined some scenes, I've outlined some color schemes, and I've sort of created a storyboard for that. And I'm trying to get I'm getting the input from the architect. So I've sent the storyboard to the architect to ask them to comment on that. And then hopefully they will send that to the owner and get some input from the owner as to what the owner wants to see for this color changing system, because that's a whole other set of issues that I didn't really cover in this session, but outlining color changing schemes is a whole issue. So if you can, and I think if I understand your question correctly, if you can get input from the owner, that's really helpful. But I find that the owner has difficulty in articulating what they want. They just don't really understand how to articulate how a lighting control system works. They just know when it doesn't work. They don't know what they want, but they know what they don't want. And
okay, Don, the questioner just clarified it might have been a typo. Did you ever experiment with a sensitization to the device? So or experiment session with the user. So you're training the user on the front end, I guess, is what the question is.
Yeah. Actually, yes. If I can get in the same place with the owner and the user, I have been able to do that in some cases. Usually that can be afterwards. If I'm going to the job site later, if the operating personnel are there, but many times I find that's difficult because the people that are going to occupy the space and work in the space are not often there when I'm finishing the construction phase. And it's only after they move in and I'm sort of long gone, and unless there's a problem, I may not actually interact with the people that are actually using the space. I can only hope that when they go into their office, the automatic sensor is going to turn the lighting on and it'll turn it off, and that they're reasonably intelligent enough to be able to push a button. I think it's getting a little bit better with the more people interact with technology and with devices that have multiple buttons on them. But again, it's and certainly younger people I think have an easier time with lighting control systems than maybe older people. But it's hard to if you can't coordinate with the actual user, the person that's going to occupy that space. So that would be great if we could.
Yeah. All right. I think we just have one more question that's a little off topic, but it's a young professional that's looking for some advice. He says, I'm a
Okay.
young theatrical lighting and production design professional with 2 degrees in architecture and will probably transition from live entertainment to architectural lighting in a few more years. I see that you also have a background in theater and scenic design. How does your theater background help you to stand out from the rest and be as successful as you are?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And many people on this call and on this presentation that are with us live have a background in theater. So this is a very typical path that people take moving into architecture. And I do think that my theatrical background is a big help, certainly with in designing performance spaces or designing classrooms that like that one that I was talking about in the presentation. I understand how to put a DMX system together, and so that makes it much easier. And then it also allows me to understand how to convey a color storyboard to a client and for a color changing system. So, but I think the 2 strongest things that I feel my theatrical background gives me is a sense of composition. And I think we don't talk a lot about that, but composition and the composition of light and the hierarchy of light is really important. And I believe you really get that in theater, and you have the opportunity to experiment live with that hierarchy of light and the ability to compose a scene. So I think that and color and the use of color. So those 2, composition and color, are probably the strongest elements that a theatrical background can give you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dawn. Really appreciate you taking the time to give the presentation. And thank you all for attending.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. And have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.